Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how are you today? Well, in today's video, we are going to be talking about this book once again. Okay, this is the third episode of the Great Depression. When our slow freight to nowhere pulled into a small Iowa town, my traveling buddy and I were more than happy to jump off of it. It was just past dawn, and we were both very weary from the long, cold night on the noisy freight. We also were terribly hungry. Although there was a cafe near the freight yard, we both knew that they wouldn't be putting out any free food. After all, times were tough in 1931. Like thousands of other young men of our generation, John and I had decided to ride the freights, to look for work. It was a rough life, and meals weren't easy to come by. The two of us split up by trying to knock on the back doors for handouts. We knew that if we went as a pair, we would intimidate people, and that was just another way to go hungry. At first, I had no luck at all. Either no one was home or it was made clear that I was not welcome. To make matters worse, the sun was well up and I was becoming very thirsty. I decided to try one last house before moving on to another neighborhood. Walking around to the back of the house, I knocked on the door frame of a screened-in porch. Just as I turned to leave, a voice from behind the screen said, "Yes?" Looking back, I saw a matronly woman in an apron waiting my answer. Quickly, I explained that I was hungry and thirsty and that I would be happy to mow her lawn, wash her windows, or do just about any task for a sandwich and a cool drink. She opened the door and gave me a long look before inviting me in. I followed her into the kitchen where she gave me a studied look before asking, "How long since you had a bath?" The question startled me, but I answered, "About 2 weeks ago." She asked me to follow her upstairs to the bathroom. As we climbed the stairs, I began to wonder what in the world was going on. "Here's your soap," she said. "There are the towels, and when you have taken off your outer clothes, place them outside the door, and I will brush them off." I was so overwhelmed by this motherly lady that I was unable to speak. All I could do was simply nod. Bathed, dressed, feeling like a new man, I went downstairs to the kitchen. It wasn't hard to find. All I had to do was follow the wonderful aroma to our stove. The lady motioned to me to sit down and then placed a heaping plate of food before me. On it were cottage fried potatoes, eggs sunny side up, toast, and jam. While I was putting away the delicious king-size breakfast, this quiet and enigmatic lady stared at me with unconcealed interest. "I have a son who looks very much like you. How old are you?" she asked. 20, I replied. "My son will soon be 20, she offered. Then after a pause, she added, "He went on the bum last spring. He was going to California to look for work." After another long pause, she continued, "He sent me a card from Salt Lake City about 2 months ago, and since then, I haven't heard from him." I thought she was going to cry, but she remained dry-eyed. "I'm sure he's okay," I said in a fumbling attempt to assure her. "If anything had happened, I'm sure you would have heard." It didn't seem like she heard my last comment at all. Her thoughts were obviously elsewhere. Her silence was making me uncomfortable. So I asked what sort of work she would like me to do in exchange for the meal. "No, you don't need to work," she replied. "I want you to go home to your folks and stay there." That will be your pay for me for your breakfast." There didn't seem to be anything left to say, so I thanked her and walked to the door. As I opened it, she softly said, "Can we hope that someone has fed my son this morning?" I stopped and turned to answer, "Yes, we can." With that simple assurance, I left, thanking her one last time for her kindness. When I reached the front sidewalk, I looked back. She was still standing at the screen door. I waved, but through the screen, I couldn't be sure whether she had waved back or not. The sun was now high in the cloudless sky, predicting a very hot afternoon. As I made my way back to the freight yard, I thought about the calm and quiet lady who'd been so kind to me. Walking along the streets of that Solomon, Iowa town, I slowly began to realize that she really hadn't seen me as an unkempt stranger, hoping for a handout. Instead, she'd seen a son who needed a bath, fresh clothes, and a meal. I only hope that someday she got the chance to welcome him home for real and for good. The Great Depression came to Harlowtown, Montana, at a very inopportune time, according to my mother. She and her friend, Mrs. Lay, were in the midst of preparations for their annual payback dinner for bridge parties, which meant entertaining 12 different ladies each day for 3 consecutive days. Mom's theory was that once the house was cleaned and food could be prepared for 36 women as easily as for 12, and she and her friend would repay all their social obligations in one fell swoop. These parties always followed a spring cleaning frenzy. The living rooms and dining rooms had been freshly wallpapered for that year's parties. The rugs were beaten, the windows were washed until they sparkled, and all the furniture was polished. Then Mom and Mrs. Lay started preparing the food, while my friend and I set the tables with linen cloths and napkins, newly polished silverware, crystal goblets, the company, china, and a green springtime centerpiece of freshly gathered sweet peas. The final touch was hand-painted place cards made by Mrs. Lay's daughter, an art student. Everything was going well until Dad came home unexpectedly from his drugstore. Something must have been wrong. You could set your clock by his timetable, yet here he was, home at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We started firing questions at him. When he stopped to catch our breath, he told us the bank had closed and all of our money was gone. We'd heard about the stock market crash the previous October, but that was New York. In Montana, we didn't deal in stocks and bonds. We dealt in sheep and cattle and dryland farms. What happened in New York couldn't affect our bank, but it had. After much discussion, Mom and Dad and Mrs. Lay decided to go ahead with the parties. The food had been bought, and most of us already prepared. Besides, the guests would be in the same spot we were. Their money would be gone too, but for the next 3 days we enjoyed the last of the good old days. The parties went on as scheduled, and for a brief time the bank closure and its ensuing problems were shoved aside. Reality set in soon enough. Instead of cash transactions, my father bartered medicine for eggs, pills for produce, tonics for meat. I guess I was too young to realize how my folks struggled to survive that period, but they did, and I never felt deprived. Thanks to them, I still look back on my childhood as a happy, carefree time. There may have been a shortage of money, but there was never a shortage of love and caring, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Does the Depression bring back bad memories for you? Not me. My childhood was A warm and busy time. Mama and Daddy and our 4 older brothers were the center of my world. Aunts and uncles lived with us briefly as they began their lives in the city, enlarging the circle of love. Daddy was an electrician for the railroad in Birmingham, Alabama. We lived in the middle-class neighborhood made up of railroad employees, executives, and laborers. I don't remember when Daddy was laid off. My only bad memory is a time when I saw Mama crying and heard the word foreclosure. I knew it must be a bad word. My memory album is filled with happier times, like the days I followed my dad about. He was a jack of all trades and did electrical repairs, painting, and carpentry to supplement his commissary privileges from the railroad. Sometimes there was no pay for odd jobs, but Dad was happy to take care of the neighbors' fix-it problems anyway. His payment often was a bushel of sweet potatoes, a box of peaches, grapes or strawberries, or hand-me-down garments. I also enjoyed following Daddy to his garden plot several blocks away. He'd gotten a permit from the city to cultivate an unimproved street. I tagged along while he cleared the stumps and vines, spaded the soil, and planted corn, pole beans, butter beans, squash, okra, and tomatoes. The loomy swell of newly turned earth surrounded me like a snug blanket. Aromas of that time occupy a special chapter in my memory album. Whiffs of Mama's rolls and buttery tea cakes always summoned the neighborhood kids. Velvet beans cooking in an iron wash pot in the backyard to feed our milk cow smelled good enough to dip into. City zoning didn't prohibit farm animals then, and the neighbors didn't complain because they shared in our cow, Dotsy's fresh milk and butter. From time to time, our larder was blessed with a care package from my grandmother. Then we'd have smoked sausage, ham, and fried chicken, and there was a sugarcane syrup so thick it had to be pried out of the can. We went to church regularly with our neighbors, and church wasn't my favorite place, but I hated having to be so still and quiet. But I can't remember a time when I didn't believe that God answered prayers and took care of us. A tithe was set aside from whatever income we received, whether it was from Daddy's odd jobs or my brother's Western Union and newspaper deliveries. I'll never forget those years. Neighbors helping neighbors, sharing whatever good fortune came their way, doctors rendering services regardless of patients' finances, and worship with friends whose faith far outdistanced their troubles. These were the memories that have kept my feet on a secure path throughout the years. Frank and I were married in June 1929 and lived with his parents for the first year of our marriage so we could save money to build a house. The Depression started that October, but we both kept our jobs. With our savings and a loan from the local German club, we built a small house the following year. The month we moved in, Frank's employer went out of business. I still had my job, but it was difficult to live on just my salary because my hours had been cut. Frank was a machinist, and he looked everywhere for a job. He finally found one after several weeks, but had to walk miles to and from work each day since we had no car. After about a year, the company failed too. When our first child was born in 1932, I quit my job. Mothers didn't work in those days. Meanwhile, the Depression deepened, and Frank went out every morning looking for a job, any kind of job. Once he scrubbed the floor of a restaurant and peeled potatoes. He also made deliveries for a liquor store. Some days he'd make a few dollars, some days nothing. We couldn't keep up the payments on our house, but the German club kindly agreed not to foreclose if we could keep up the interest payments. To save money, we turned our whole backyard into a garden. I canned vegetables and fruit, and we buried carrots from our garden and sand in a small, cool spot under our porch. We refused to go on welfare, and so did many others. Men were selling apples on the street corners, standing in long soup lines. Families were moving back in with their folks. Many houses were empty in those years. One house in our block sat vacant for a year, finally sold for $4,500. In 1990, 60 years later, that same house sold for $80,000. In 1935, our son was born. Since we had no money for a hospital delivery, he was born at our home. The doctor charged us $25. After odd jobs, Frank found a job driving a delivery truck, a steady job, finally, with $25 coming in every week. We were in the seventh heaven. We hadn't had that much income in years. We were young, healthy, resolute. We were determined. The depression wouldn't defeat us, and it didn't. When I was growing up, most of our neighbors were of Swedish descent. They were involved in many activities, meetings, dances, church gatherings, coffee parties, and sewing circles. They all loved to get together and talk about current events and reminisce about their childhood days. When the Depression came along, my father lost his job as a cabinet maker. My two married sisters and their husbands moved in with us, my brother and I still in school. The only person in the household who was working was one of my sisters who had a job as a saleswoman in a Boston department store. That one salary bought food for all 8 of us. After the Depression had gone on for several months, many of our Swedish neighbors wanted to do something to help those who were having difficult time making ends meet. They began organizing 1 or 2 surprise parties every month. One Saturday night, about 8 o'clock, we heard a knock at the door. It was a surprise party for us. There must have been about 125 of our friends there, bringing all kinds of preserves, vegetables, bread, baked goods, and other necessities. My mother was so happy she burst into tears. After we'd all enjoyed the traditional treat of coffee and coffee bread, one member of our group presented my mother and father with an envelope containing $157 in bills and coins. In those days, that was a lot of money. These gifts kept our family going for quite a long time. It was one of the nicest things that ever happened to us. It was early 1933. I came home from school in the afternoon and saw my father and mother in the kitchen, holding hands over the table. My father was crying, something I had never seen before. I said, "What's wrong, Daddy?" He immediately straightened up, wiped his eyes, and took one of my shoulders. "Son," he said, "I lost my job today. But we have nothing to worry about. We will get through this together until I find another job." Dad didn't get another job until sometime in 1935, yet he never complained or worried, and because of that, I never worried about it at the time either. The quiet confidence my mother and father instilled in our family got us all through the bad times, and it stays with me even today. Dad went on to become a successful salesman and had many happy years after his retirement. Now I'm retired myself, and I still attribute my good life to my father, who never doubted himself. Donald Gall, Burlington, Wisconsin. Although I wasn't born until 1936, the Depression taught me a valuable lesson. One of my earliest memories is of delivering an envelope to a woman named Mrs. Combs every Friday night. When I was old enough to ask what the envelope contained, I learned Mrs. Combs had been my parents' landlord during the years when my father had only odd jobs and couldn't pay the rent. Those envelopes contained back rent payments, even though we no longer lived in Mrs. Combs' house. Martha Lesor, West Palm Beach, Florida. Dad lost his job early in the Depression, and we turned our backyard into a garden and sold the produce from house to house. My most vivid memory is the day my mother sold a 3-cent stamp so we could buy bread. She only had 2 cents, so she sold the stamp to our neighbor. Then she was able to send me to the bakery for a nickel loaf of bread. Jane Hutchins, Yakima, Washington. My father took good care of us and of many others during the Depression. He and my mother ran a store and they worked hard. We moved from Alabama to Texas about 1927, and when the Depression began, families all along the route came to my dad for help. Some of the families were living in their cars and going without food. One couple arrived at the store with their 2 little boys. They were tired, hungry, and discouraged. My dad couldn't give them any money, but since he had 5 children at home, he gave them food and a place to sleep in exchange for work. The family moved on as soon as the father found a paying job. Relatives who needed shelter came to us too. One of my teenage cousins who couldn't find work came to live with us for a while, then moved on to stay with other kinfolk who took him in. We saw a steady stream of families from Alabama. The grapevine had told them my dad would help when he could, and that's exactly what he did. Mary Heinlein, Hot Springs, Arkansas. My mother made quilts and sold them to bring in a little extra money. Her enterprise was so much of a part of our family life that I grew accustomed to walking under quilted frames in the small living room of our home in southern Illinois. As my high school graduation drew near, I wanted a class ring terribly, but there was no money to pay for one. My mother was determined to get me one. She began piecing together a double wedding ring quilt and spent long hours finishing the machine like stitches. She sold that prized quilt for $9, the price of my ring. Although my mother attended my graduation from college and later watched me receive my master's degree, neither meant as much to me as wearing the high school ring that had cost her so much time and work. I still have that ring. It will always be my prized possession. George Foster, Tucson, Arizona. We were living in Jacksonville, South Dakota when the Depression started. I was 8 years old. The youngest of 8 children, our father had died 5 years earlier, so our mother raised us alone. It was very hot and dry during those years. The older boys farmed as best they could. Many fires swept through the prairies during those drought years, and often my mother and the boys went out to help fight those blazes. Mama used her well to store the milk from our cows and our home-churned butter. She cooked our meals on a wood stove and baked 8 loaves of bread every other day. We didn't have a car, lived 5 miles from town, so Mama laid all of our grocery supplies in the fall, like 100 pounds of sugar, 10 to 12 bags of flour, and a case of coffee. She butchered her own meat and cured it in salt or canned it. Come fall, Mama would sew all of our clothes for school. The schoolhouse, 2.5-mile walk from our house, was an old log building, and every year Mama gathered Badlands dirt and mixed it with water to paint the walls. Sometimes the color came out pink, sometimes gray, other times off-white, but it always looked clean. And when Mama thought we needed some entertainment during the winter, she hitched up a team and a big soapstone, which she put in the wagon with some hay and a couple of quilts, and all of us kids would get under the covers to stay warm and go visit neighbors to work picture puzzles. Our mother never lost her temper. She loved us and praised us for whatever we could do to help out. Even after we were grown and married, she was always proud of us. She loved us right up until God took her home. Frances Jensen, Kimball, South Dakota. I wanted desperately to go to college, but during the Depression years, there were no funds available. So at age 16, I decided to earn some money during the summer. My parents suggested baking. The local grocer allowed me to have a couple of shelves in his store, so I placed a sign there that said Maryland's Home Baking. I got up each morning at 4 and had all of my baking done by 10 and delivered it to the grocer, who received 10% of the sales. My parents furnished the milk, flour, and butter, and I paid for the rest of my supplies. By the end of the summer, I netted $150. One evening, our family was invited to dinner at my aunt and uncle's house. When I opened the napkin, I found a check for $100. My uncle said since I was willing to work so hard to reach my goal, maybe he could help in a small way. Small? It was the nicest thing anyone had ever done for me. Marilyn Pafford, Dos Palos, California. When my dad's salary was cut from $19 a week to only $14, Mom answered an ad to do piecework at home. She brought home pounds of sparkling beads to string, which were used to adorn the pretty dresses that were in style then. Every evening after supper, Mom, my sister, and I would sit at the kitchen table and string those beads. Although my sister and I were just kids, we felt so proud to help our parents. I was lucky. Then my best friend Rosie, her father had no job, so he sold apples on a street corner, and Rosie would shine them for him. During those years in New York City, almost every street corner had a jobless man selling apples in all kinds of weather. I'm a grandmother now and still have to count my pennies, but I count my blessings as well. Gladys Mitchell, Portland, Oregon. Everyone had problems during the Depression, and my parents were no different. They lost most of their money when the building and loan closed. My father's company had fell on hard times too. Some weeks he only had one day of work. Other weeks he had none. We fell further and further behind on our taxes, although my parents paid as much as they could. One day my mother gathered $5 and walked to the city hall to put it toward the past due bill. As she stood in line waiting to make her payment, she looked around the room and saw men and women who looked completely defeated and ready to give up. Some of them feared losing their homes and did not know which way to turn. Then and there, my mother decided she would not be broken by the Depression. And when she reached the payment window, she said, "I want to pay $4.90 towards my back taxes." She left with her dime and change, walked across the street to Woolworths, sat down at the lunch counter, and ordered a 10-cent ice cream soda. My mother was not defeated by the Depression. She held her head high throughout her long life to the age of 91. Marion Roberts, Oakland, New Jersey. That's all for this video. I will see you tomorrow with another episode of the Great Depression. Stay safe, stay positive, keep prepping, and as always,